Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo Wine info video where today's wine of the day is a fantastic excuse to talk about two important things. The first is the fascinating reinvention of the Stellenbosch estate of Vergenoegd Löw, and the second is another chance to visit the incredibly interesting emerging category of coastal Syrahs coming out of South Africa. By the way, if you want to stay up to speed with this sort of geeky wine stuff and wine history, wine science, winemaking trends, and some of these dynamic South African winemakers, then subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel where we have more than 350 videos exactly like this one. And give us a like because it helps more people like you to find our content. Vergenoegd Löw Estate was founded in 1696. So to give you an idea of how old that is, wine was pressed for the very first time in the entire Cape Winelands in only 1659. So it was within 40 years of that. But despite being one of South Africa's older estates, its modern history has been less wine focused and perhaps more about their runner ducks, and people would come from around the world to watch these large flocks of runner ducks running through the vineyards eating snails. But that has all changed in a delightfully, deliciously wine and vine focused way, as we've seen this estate be resurrected not only through the replanting of a whole bunch of their vineyards, but also to the redesignation of many of their vine blocks, remaining very faithful to the actual outline of the soil seams and soil types on the estate. And in one sense, one asks, why on earth is this a relatively recent breakthrough? Why wasn't this always the way that vine blocks were designated? Then beyond that, they've also hired an exciting young winemaker, Vusi Dalicuba, who has also in the last 2 or so years won himself a handful of Platter 4.5-star wines, a Platter 4-star wine, and also been named as one of the top 10 finalists in Wine Mag's Next Gen Most Exciting Young Winemaker competition. But what about the ducks? I hear you cry. And they still have the ducks, so they are still pioneering regenerative agriculture in the use of animals in the vineyards. But instead of just keeping it to themselves on their own estate, they are also now donating members of their ever-growing flock of Egyptian runner ducks to estates in the surrounding area who are also wanting to explore regenerative agriculture in one way or another. So they are not only reviving themselves and bringing new life to the area, but they're also being a force for good to their neighboring estates as well. Vergenoegd Löw Estate lies in the informal but still very cool Stellenbosch wine ward of Eersterivier, which is a kind of triangle of very low-lying, rather flat vineyards that includes iconic estates like Meerlist and Winshaw family vineyards. The former of those two is the absolute oldest family business in any industry in South Africa, and the latter was founded by Charles Winshaw, who was the genius mind behind Chateau Libertas, which is their 1957 vintage, was actually the first South African wine to ever earn a perfect 100 points. And Charles Winshaw was also the man behind the founding of the Stellenbosch Farmers Winery, which has essentially inspired almost everything we know about modern Stellenbosch winemaking. So there really is a lot of rich history to be found in this fascinating little area. Perhaps most relevantly for today's discussion, this little patch of vineyards is ridiculously close to the ocean, which makes these estates noticeably cooler than those located in wards that are perhaps a little further inland. And why is this relevant, you might ask? Well, apart from the fact that cooling ocean influences are generally seen as a really good thing, beyond that, there's this category of coastal Syrahs that are getting people really very excited when it comes from places like Darling on the west coast, or perhaps Agulhas down on the Cape South coast, more specifically in Elim, which is a ward inside that, or even further east in the Lower Rivier, where estates like Belaya are situated that are producing some really rather elegant wines, strongly influenced by that cold ocean airflow. But Eersterivier shows us that we really should be including in this discussion around coastal Syrahs, which by and large defy the New World expectation of our Shirazes, which is that they are bolshy and tannic and flabby and loads of fruit and not much else, whereas coastal Syrahs out of the regions I just mentioned are often more spiced, a little more elegant, slightly leaner, with a little more structure and poise. This wine is made in a slightly unusual fashion in the sense that the grapes are destemmed in part, but then those stems are dried and then added back into the fermentation vat at a later stage. So what you get is you get the slightly fuller, more concentrated tannic parcels that result from grapes that are destemmed and macerated, but then you also get the aromatic and herbal and pepper spice that comes from that whole bunch fermentation where the stems are included. So it's kind of like achieving the best of both worlds in an unusual manner. Another thing to note is that the fruit comes from two very different parcels, one of which is trellised, the other is a bush vine vineyard which is planted on the edge of the estate closest to the ocean, right alongside the N2 arterial. And this bush vine vineyard is partially planted with a very exciting clone called S04.Ep63, which is sourced from the Rhone originally and is really renowned for its incredibly high quality. And the Rhone is, of course, the indigenous home of Syrah/Shiraz. As Vusi describes it, the bush vine component gives you smaller berries, a lot more concentrated and tannic wines, whereas the trellised vineyards deliver a little more fruit. And so you balance those two with the bush vine giving you the spine and the structure, and the other vineyard giving you a little more plush fruit. But rather than talk about the vineyards, let's get into the glass and see what it tastes like. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, I kind of feel like you really can feel the two components side by side, because you do get some lovely fresh blackberry and you get some cherry fruit, but then you get slightly moodier herbal notes. There is pepper spice for definite, a touch of kind of lavender, but also more savory and surly notes of perhaps fennel and even some savory black olive tapenade. And I'd say it's quite likely that those pepper spice notes have probably been elevated by those stems that were thrown back into the fermentation. So let's give it a sip. Well, what we get in the glass is a really quite tidy Shiraz. It's certainly not the kind of ethereal, wild, aromatic, ballerina, showstopper, light type style that you might get from the Poker Dry Hills, but it's also not the super surly, kelpy, seaweed, salty, sea dog type Syrahs that you get from Elam. It's kind of a wine that presents elements of both of those styles, which is delightful. So as we sensed on the nose, you get some really quite lush, well-formed blackberry fruit and red cherry fruit, but then you also get spice, a little bit of structure, and a touch of that savory olive, which really is quite common in Syrahs from coastal vineyards. As the wine kind of draws to a close, you get more of the blackberry fruit lingering beautifully alongside that really quite delicate pepper spice that really is there from the beginning, in the middle, and right through into the tail. So a very tidy wine, and I really think this is one to watch for the future as Vusi becomes more familiar with the fruit and the vineyards. So that's all we have time for today, but I have left a link to two videos, one of which talks about Meerlist Estate, one of the oldest estates in that Eersterivier ward, and the other of which is another Vergenoegd wine, their Valentina Malbec, which will give you a slightly deeper idea of the sort of changes that are going on at the estate.